Abraham Lincoln died just hours after being shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, had also been targeted for murder, but the assassin never carried it out. Johnson immediately took the oath of office and became the 17th president of the United States. Andrew Johnson had only been inaugurated as vice president a month before. He had not served during Lincoln's first term. He was a Southerner with humble roots, and he had been picked as Lincoln's running mate because he was the only senator from a Confederate state, Tennessee, who had remained loyal to the Union. In fact, Johnson wasn't even a Republican. He was a Democrat who had joined Lincoln on a national Union ticket designed to appeal to voters of both parties in the 1964 election. Only because of a shocking assassination did a Southern Democrat replace a Northern Republican as president right as the Civil War came to an end. Congress was out of session when Johnson became president in April 1865. In fact, Congress would not officially meet again until December of that year. This created a leadership vacuum that the new president was more than happy to fill. Johnson took it upon himself to create Reconstruction policy, believing, as Lincoln had, that it was an executive responsibility. Like Lincoln had during the war, Johnson wanted Southern states to rejoin the Union easily and in the spirit of reconciliation. But, unlike Lincoln, the new president was a deeply racist man, whose views were representative of many white Southerners at the time. Johnson called Black Americans inferior to the white man in point of intellect, and he said they were best suited to undergo drudgery and hardship. Johnson himself had personally owned slaves until 1862. Now, even though he had accepted emancipation as part of the Constitution, Johnson was utterly unconcerned with the circumstances of freedmen. He did not support black suffrage, unlike Lincoln. In 1865, the United States faced a moment of reckoning as to the future of African Americans. And at this crucial time, the White House was occupied by an accidental president who was at best unfriendly to black people, and at worst was a proud white supremacist. Johnson's Reconstruction plan made it easy for Confederate states to return to the Union. All the states had to do was to form conventions that renounced their right to secede and ratified the 13th Amendment. Johnson did not require even 10% of the voters to take a loyalty oath, as Lincoln had suggested. Johnson was willing to pardon almost all ex-rebels, and he ordered all their abandoned and confiscated land returned to them, even though some of it had already been granted to former slaves by the Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency established by Congress. The president was indifferent to the issue of civil rights for African Americans. He allowed Southern states to handle the matter as they saw fit. There is actually much to admire in the life of Andrew Johnson, who was born into poverty in North Carolina. He was mostly illiterate until the age of 17. Despite this, Johnson became a successful tailor and congressman, the governor of Tennessee, a senator, and vice president of the United States. But Johnson often found himself the target of jokes and public ridicule. He did himself no favors by apparently having too much to drink before being inaugurated, and then giving a long, slurred, rambling speech that had to be cut short by the outgoing vice president. Johnson swore his oath of office on the Bible and said, "I kiss this book in the face of my nation, the United States." Lincoln forbid Johnson to speak any more at the ceremony. Johnson hid from the public in shame afterward, but Lincoln defended him. "It has been a severe lesson for Andy, and I do not think he will do it again. Andy ain't a drunkard." A month later, Johnson would be president. The southern states of the former Confederacy reacted to Johnson's lenient policies, quickly following the minimal requirements needed to rejoin the Union. They also took advantage of the president's indifferent attitude towards the status of freedmen. Starting with Mississippi, new state governments across the South adopted laws known as Black Codes, starting in 1865. They were intended to keep blacks legally inferior to whites by denying them important rights to vote, to travel freely, to serve on juries, to own guns. In many cases, Black Codes borrowed the exact language of nearly identical laws that had denied those rights to slaves before the Civil War, simply replacing the word slave with the word Negro. Some black codes forced freedmen back into the roles they had occupied as slaves, like farm laborers and domestic servants, by penalizing them with taxes if they found other work. Often, black codes declared that if African Americans failed to show written evidence of employment, they could be arrested for vagrancy. Once in custody, prisoners could be leased out to private entities like plantation owners and forced to labor against their will. Convict leasing lasted in the South well into the 20th century. Some historians have labeled the practice slavery by another name. Florida's black codes were particularly harsh. Vagrants could be sentenced to a year of forced labor, and their children could be hired out to others as apprentices. The state forbid white women to live with men of color, anyone who had at least one black great-grandparent, and black workers could be punished for disrespecting white employers. The purpose of black codes was unmistakable. Although they were forced to accept emancipation, most Southern states wanted to recreate the conditions of slavery as much as they legally could. President Johnson did not object to the black codes. He said that states' rights gave Southerners the power to write their own constitutions and laws. With the former rebel states prepared to hold elections and fully rejoin the Union, Johnson considered Reconstruction basically accomplished under his leadership. Black codes are often confused with Jim Crow laws. Both had the effect of limiting black civil rights after the Civil War, but black codes were generally much harsher and stem from 1865 to 1866. Most of these laws would be overturned in the coming years under congressional reconstruction, but some, like convict leasing, lingered far longer in various forms. Jim Crow laws stem from the 1870s and the decades beyond, creating a system of legal segregation in the former Confederacy that lasted until the 1960s. In the 1896 decision Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court declared that Jim Crow segregation was legal as long as separate but equal facilities were maintained for both races. Let's practice. Andrew Johnson opposed the laws known as black codes, but Southern states passed them anyway. Click thumbs up if this statement is true, and thumbs down if it's false. You got it. Andrew Johnson was uninterested in protecting the precarious rights of former slaves in the South. He preferred a policy of states' rights that allowed states to treat the freedmen as they saw fit. Black codes were the unfortunate result. It's been a pleasure learning with you so far. This isn't the end of the story, but it is the end of part 1 of this tutorial. In part 2, you'll learn about the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. See you soon.